All right. So once again, thank you everyone for being part of FCI Live and coming out today. This is the first in our series, Handing Over the Purse Strings, a peer discussion about that transition of financial control from the board to the GM as your GM comes on your co-op. We have definitely found in the last couple of years that this is a critical point in food co-op development that needs, honestly, more thought, support, and help, which is the transition from full board control to operational control to the GM. And so we've gotten a lot of questions from you all. Thank you for letting us know you want more on this topic. And so many of you asked to get a chance to speak to Siobhan or Rich about their experience with this topic that we thought it'd be best to bring them together and talk to everyone at once. So thank you so much to Siobhan and Rich for being here today and sharing their time with us. And with that, real quick, Siobhan is the current board chair, although she is gloriously and excitedly about to hand that off after I don't know how many years. She can tell you in a moment. And Rich has, their co-op has 1-year terms for board presidents, and then it has to change, but he's been the board president, I believe, 3 times, although he is currently the treasurer. And so both of them have been with their co-ops a long time and have a lot to share, and we're going to go ahead and get into that. I'm going to turn it over to you, Siobhan.
Hi. I'm excited to be here. So JQ had asked Rich and I both to just put together just a quick timeline of when the GM came in and how that transition took place. So for us here at Asabat, we had a site fall through. So that was a little bit of an unusual circumstance for us that hopefully none of you will have to experience. So we secured a site. We did our announcement in September of last year. Our hiring committee got to work. We made a selection. We made a job offer. They accepted the job. And then our site fell through. We did keep our GM because they're a great GM. And we knew that we were going to want to try to find another site. And we knew that it would be even better if we had their help. So Sam started with us right at the beginning of the calendar year, right in January. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit more as we go through. But the date that checkbook went to Sam was actually on April 1st. So basically 3 months later. And we have a new site, and we're actually announcing tonight to all of our owners. So that's very exciting for us.
So that's tonight. I think we'll just take a moment. Everyone give that a little huzzah and congratulations that they're announcing tonight. And just want to note, keep an eye on, we're here to talk about the financial transition. The GM was hired, and 3 months later, the trust and systems had been built to hand over financial control and the checkbook. Keep in mind that amount of time, because you'll be hearing more from Siobhan about why it was that length of time, why it wasn't longer, why it wasn't shorter. And you'll want to factor in that kind of remembering that length with what you're going to learn about the skills and strengths of this board and this GM and how that affected how long that transition took. All right, I'm going to, I'm going to then ask if Rich could introduce us to his food co-op and their little timeline here.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank all of you for the work you're doing in your community. You make a difference, and the work you're doing is not easy, but it will have long-term benefits. So the Fredericksburg Food Co-op, we actually incorporated in September of 2015. I like to start with that because we worked really hard for a lot of years. We had a site selection committee. We met for about 1.5 years, looked at dozens of sites. We announced a site right during our first owner loan campaign. We launched a campaign before having a site. We announced the site during the campaign in May of 2019. We began looking for a general manager. It was not easy to find a general manager. We had national headhunters. And then we had a board retreat with Jacqueline Hanna. And she said, I know this guy who I think there's maybe a 5% chance he might be interested. By the end of the weekend, it was a 1% chance. But if you want me to go and see if he'll be interested, we can do that. So she did, and we hired him. And so that was great. We hired him actually in November of 2019. but he was a co-op manager at another co-op, doing a great job there. And so he didn't actually come on board full-time until February of 2020. In the meantime, we finalized our, so in May, we had control of the site, but we had a period during which we could look at it and back out. We finalized that long-term lease that gives us control of the location for 30 years. We did that just around Christmas in 2019. And you say, why did you wait that long? Well, because we had until the 31st. So we waited until right around that time to finalize it. That's kind of the way it is. So in February, Chris Rowland, our general manager, came to Fredericksburg full time. We began transitioning the checkbook control soon after he came to town. Now, we had a practice from the very beginning, which FCI recommended, and you hear about it for a lot of other organizations, where every check we signed was signed by at least 2 people. Not that we didn't trust each other, but that was like a best practice. We always followed that. So we continued to follow that practice with Chris for quite a long time, even after turning over the checkbook to him. Opening day was April 1st. So we just had our first quarter. And I guess we'll be talking about a lot of these other points later on in the session. So that's kind of a quick thumbnail of our timeline.
Great. Thank you so much, Rich. When we talked ahead of time, me and Rich and Siobhan, and we were like, what was the main points? What do we really want to get across? What are the things to note about this financial transition between board and GM? And these are the 3 things we came up with. So this is what we're going to talk about today. First, that it is a transition, that it's not immediate handoff, that it isn't like, oh, the GM showed up, woo, here goes the checkbook. And so we're going to talk a little about Rich and Siobhan's experiences of their food co-ops with that, and what went through their minds about deciding how quickly to hand over how much of that financial control, and how much was it all at once, was it in pieces, and what factors went into making that decision for them. I am going to take a moment to talk about how actually industry advice on this, in my opinion, needs to change. And a lot of people's opinion needs to change. And I'll take a moment with that. Then we're going to talk about the second most important thing we want you to know, which is when you hand over the checkbook, reporting begins. And this is called the line of sight, that how critical in this transition something called the line of sight is. We'll talk a little about what it is real quick. And Siobhan will talk about what that means and how reporting began for them. Rich will also talk about how reporting began for them, and then something shifted and line of sight had to change, or they were going to lose, something had to change, or they were going to lose their line of sight, and what that was like, what that experience was. And then last, we will talk about the budget and pro forma is a shared document between the board and GM, but ultimately is actually the board's document. And this has a lot of impact in how your financial transition goes. And I don't mean just the day you hand the checkbook, but the financial transition is continual through the spending of the money to build the business, and then getting those first financial results until we have real financial stability or meeting goals. And so we'll talk a little bit through both of co-op's experience with that as well. So with that, I'm gonna actually let us talk face to face for a minute and actually see one another. And then we'll be jumping back to a few slides in a minute, but let's talk about how there's an impression out there, for good reason, that I'll get to the end of this one, that it's just hey, the GM shows up, take it, woohoo, we're done, just send in a report. And there's a lot of that impression out there. It's been created by the industry, by the way. You didn't get that by accident if you got it. But what we've really learned in the last 3 years is that's not how it needs to go, that it's a transition with steps and pieces, not a throw it at them and you're done. And so I wanted to ask Rich, if you could, you mentioned something I thought was really interesting when we first talked about this, doing this session, which was, what could we possibly say that is standardized about how this transition should go? Because it's going to depend so much on the board and the incoming GM's skill set. I'd love to have you talk about what that means and then how you weighed that in your decisions about financial transition.
Sure. So I think, like all of you who have been on co-op boards or been volunteers, we all work long and hard. In our case, we were working 5.5 years. You're at the farmer's market every Saturday, you're doing events, you're leaning on all of your friends and neighbors and everyone to join the co-op. And you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this, or else the co-op doesn't happen. So the model of like hiring, a person and just saying, okay, I'm all done now. I mean, it's not very logical. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's really a partnership. I think you need to use common sense. I think we all need to use common sense. And so I think it's when it comes to financial reporting and financial transition, I think it's a function of a couple of things. One is, what are the skill sets on the board? So in our case, we have 9 board members. 3 of the board members are, I would say, extremely financially competent. One worked one was a financial planner, very astute. Another has a deep background in finance. I was a senior vice president at a $25 billion co-op lender. And others have been getting a lot of training. So we were deeply involved in the pro forma. We were deeply involved in working with Colluminate and their predecessor company. We were
Did Rich freeze for everyone else? Yep. All right, Rich, you froze up. So we lost you after you were deeply involved with Colluminate and their predecessor company. And I don't know that you're coming back right this second. Oh, there you are.
Oh, so sorry. I don't know what happened there. I don't know how much you heard.
We heard through you guys were deeply involved in the pro forma, working with Colluminate on it, and it stopped right about there.
Okay. So we hired a great general manager, and I think his strength is probably in the operations area. He's, been a general manager. He's been working for the food co-ops for 20 years. He knows a lot about all the aspects of a co-op. He's not primarily a finance person. We had at least 3 of the 9 on the board who have deep background in finance. And so, it's a transition. You figure things out together. Even after you get reporting, you need to, look at the financials. You need to ask a lot of questions. It's very possible that on your board, you may have finance people who.
You've frozen us again, Rich. So I'm going to take this moment and switch to Siobhan. We'll shift back to you for any final comments on this question if you unfreeze in just a bit. So I'm going to pitch it to Siobhan and say, so as Rich was pointing out, there's different skill sets. His board was very strong financially. His GM had good background, but maybe not as much, dominance in the financial area. And so that affected their timeline and how they did the transition. How did that play out for you guys in considering the board versus this incoming GM strengths? What were the GM strengths around finance?
Yeah, so I would say that on our board, and I'm guessing it's probably common for a lot of startups and probably for the majority of you, maybe you have 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 directors who kind of understand the pro forma. But nobody else really does. So I'm actually one of those people that does understand the pro forma. I actually also have a background in financial planning and in loan underwriting. So our GM, though, is very strong in that area. So that is one place where they didn't need professional development. And so what we did with our 3 months was Sam had come in and said, we need to change some of these systems. We had a lot of systems that worked very well for us and would continue to work very well for us as long as we were a startup, but they were not going to work well enough with an open store. So Sam wanted to upgrade our QuickBooks. We had been using our accountant's QuickBooks, and Sam switched us so that we had our own QuickBooks that the accountants just had access to, but we could do more with it because it's a better QuickBooks account. And we had been doing payroll manually, and that's not going to fly if you have more than one employee. And then Sam also needed to, or wanted to, and needed to get us onto the NCG chart of accounts, which is not what we were using. So when Sam started in January, we were about 6 months into our fiscal year. And so one of the things that Sam and I did together was go back through all of those transactions for the first 6 months of the fiscal year and remap them to the new chart of accounts once that new chart of accounts was established. So in terms of the reporting, we started getting weekly FYI reports after the kind of the initial like orientation phase. And that was a couple weeks long, actually. Sam met with a bunch of us. I did a lot of it, but I was not the only one doing it. There was a lot to introduce Sam to about us, about Assabet and all of our systems and everything that we were doing and everything that we were using, and a lot of our history. So, so after that orientation, that's when Sam and I kind of dug in together. But Sam started doing weekly FYI reports, and those are quick, right? The goal with those is it doesn't take them more than 5 minutes to write, and it doesn't take you more than 15 minutes to read, right? But it gives you a really good window into how they're spending their time, and what's coming up. What are they doing right now, and kind of what's coming up next week. And then when we finally did make that transition to going from us having the checkbook to Sam having the checkbook, we did that on a date, April 1st. That was the date. And after that, that is when financial reporting started. So Sam actually created a dashboard that they give to us every month with updated numbers. And actually, in the beginning, it overwhelmed a couple people on our board.
Let's save that for the reporting section. I want to talk about that in the reporting.
Sorry, okay.
No, that's okay. I was like, no, save that.
Yeah. But so we get monthly financial reports, and it gives us for the month and then also year to date. And then we also have started doing B1s quarterly.
Which is the executive limitations on the board, on the co-op's finances.
Because we want to practice. We want to get really good at it.
Awesome. I actually have a question for both of you. And I'll throw back to Rich for a second. That's connected to this. What were the signs that the GM gave you that you were comfortable and ready? So like, was it because this like deep trust between the board and the GM was there and you could tell he really wanted to partner with you? Is it because the GM's just clear mastery of this pro forma and the way they were talking to you about it? What were those hints? Because you have two very different GMs in the finance realm. What for each of you were those markers that were ready for this level of trust with this GM? Because a GM can say a whole bunch of things on paper, but then you've got to get them there and build the trust that they actually know what they're doing. And so what were some of those markers for you, Rich, at your guys' co-op that it was time for that?
Can you all hear me again now? Okay, so sorry about that. Yeah, I think it's for us, it was it's a combination of kind of looking at the reports that Chris started preparing for us. He did the weekly FYI report also. That goes out saying you have to have that. But in terms of the financial reports, he began preparing them, sometimes with help from our treasurer at the time. And we'd ask a lot of questions, and and we still do. We still ask a lot of questions. So I would just emphasize that it's not about the board getting out of the way. It's really about a partnership. It's really about what's best for the co-op. And I'm one who would urge the board to stay involved, to ask questions, to have visibility. But all that we want as board members, we just want to know what's going on. We want to know that it's being done well. So if you're satisfied that the financial reports are being done well, there's clarity, that's really what a board wants. We developed a dashboard that Chris follows, and he prepares he populates it for us, and he does a really good job at that. So I think every situation is different. Every general manager is different. Every board is different. So figuring out what works for you is really the right approach, in my opinion.
And it's such a good point, because what it means is there's no walking into this with confidence that you know exactly how you're going to handle this. You're going to have some preparation and some ideas, but you're going to tweak and adjust very rapidly as the relationship with the GM unfolds and you really see who you are as a joint leadership team. I think that's an excellent point. Siobhan, I want you to answer this one real quick. Like, what were the signs that built the board's comfort that this GM was who they said they were, they could do the stuff, and that the relationship was right between the two of you, as Rich is pointing to, that it was partnership rather than hand off and disappear into into the closet. What were those signs for you guys that it was time?
Yeah, I think it really just it was the development of that relationship. And again, I have more of a window into what Sam is doing than like what the official board reports kind of contain, less so now, but more so in the beginning because I was working with Sam. And it was a wonderful process. And Sam was very clear from the beginning that they were going to want some professional development in some places. And it was clear once we got into this conversation about QuickBooks, it was very clear that they were very knowledgeable and competent. And just working with them just gave us a very, very high degree of confidence in turning things over as we did and when we did.
Excellent.
If I could just
go ahead, good. Yeah.
I could just add one thing. I think a board needs to also separate out their personal relationship from their role as a board. So you can love the general manager, which we all do, and that's one thing. You can think he or she is the most wonderful person in the world, a great human being. But as a board, we have a responsibility to understand what the numbers look like. We have to have a deep understanding of that. And the general manager, through his reporting, can give you that understanding. But whether you like the person or don't like the person, the board has a job to do.
I think it's an excellent point to end this section on. And I want to note again, both Siobhan and Rich referenced, we got to see them in action and see they actually knew their stuff, but they also referenced the relationship felt right. These two GMs are very, very, very different. Chris was somebody who I think built a lot of trust with his board, and that's Fredericksburg GM. By basically, he loves partnership. One thing we can say about this GM is that he loves to partner, and sometimes he wants to tell the board. I'm like, look, the board meeting got to end sometime tonight. Like, he's a partner. He will have, and so right away, what part of the trust building was that he was so avid to build this relationship with his board and happy to answer tough questions. In Siobhan's case, I think that's also true with Sam.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I'm just going to put a little pin in, notice this trait of successful board GM transfers and successful GMs. Sometimes the relationship doesn't flow as quickly as it did for these two co-ops. That doesn't mean that it can't work at all, but it's certainly a yellow flag and something to watch if that trust is not building. I'm going to real quick share that couple slides about what I wanted to say on this piece, and then we'll keep moving. And what I wanted to say, and it's something that others have asked me, multiple people who've been through this now have asked, and I agree with them. So originally, there was a lot of, it came from inside the industry, that the idea is you work and you work and you work and you work and you work so hard for years, and then the magical unicorn that is the GM arrives on the scene. You hand them control of everything, and you just start accepting reports and you kick back. And actually, to some extent, there are even voices within the food co-op industry that have said pretty strongly, you need to ask the GM less questions. You need to sit back and sit down. That's the GMs. While in this transition phase, while in this trust building phase, very much not a partnership, kind of like we have separate jobs with separate offices and we share reports and feedback on reports, but just stay completely apart. This was standard advice in the food co-op world for a long time. I don't know if anyone else has said it. I'll be very happy to come out and say it. I hope that the workbook that we did onboard GM transition that is half done, but then hopefully some of you read makes it clear that we don't feel, I don't agree with this at all. And I think your peers on this call would happily say this as well, already have. This is a metaphor because some of people work with metaphors really well. I know I do. This came from Brenda Haynes, who is the board chair at Oshkosh Food Co-op, who just went through this financial transition on a very similar timeline. Their GM started in January and they just opened in July, at the end of July. And so she said it's like a relay race. And I was like, no, because then you just hand the baton. And she's no. She's like, yes, you know, running the race was ours for years, the whole big first part of the loop, but we can't hand it off to the next runner, the GM, the operational piece, until we have gotten our gates in alignment. We are a full partnership. We know where each other's hands are, and then we can hand off. Otherwise, it's going to drop. And this is called they actually call this the change box. I did not know this in the relay race, those red areas. And that change box is where we're building the trust and the deep partnership. That's where we are in transition. We are not just throwing the baton at them, not knowing if they're ready to take it, if their hand is there, or if our strides are in alignment. So this was a metaphor she brought up that for those of us who relish metaphors to learn, I thought was really useful. And I will just state again, I do not think it is sound advice to just hand this off to your GM. The transition will, as Rich said, look different for every startup. And we're looking for that feel and that trust. So I just wanted to stress this because a lot of you, I think, have heard things about just let the GM do it, just let the GM do it. And that's not what we're looking for. We're also not looking to micromanage the GM. We're looking to build a trusting partnership. And either partner could be part of why that's not happening if you end up in that situation, even with the very, very best of intentions. So if you don't end up with this perfect relationship transition that these two startups had, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a failure on either side, but it means that needs to be investigated. So before we move on, we're going to talk about handing off the checkbook equals reporting and what reporting looks like at both these startups. I'll pause for a second, say any burning questions right now, or feel free to throw them in the chat. Okay. So checkbook equals reporting, or what I was also called line of sight equals everything. I'm actually gonna, again, I'm super visual. Sorry, we'll start slide again for just a minute. And what I mean by line of sight, this is from Oshkosh, from a training I did with them, but this is their building. This is the building that they have built now and have opened. And they had their hands on all of it when there was no GM, right? They lost sleep, they were overwhelmed, but they had their hands on all of it. They could touch and see any part of this project. This building represents the co-op. And then the GM arrived. And you say, okay, well, the GM arrives and we need windows. We need a line of sight. We need to be able to see what's going on with the co-op. And let's say the GM with the best of intentions hands over some reports, and this is their line of sight. Well, the reports are covering X and Y, but the main part of what's going on with we're not able to see this. The GM may not realize that the reports at first aren't giving you the line of sight you need to see what's going on with the co-op. The relationship might not be where it needs to be, that you're getting proper line of sight. So it's critical to readjust and get that line of sight. And so line of sight is when the board hands over responsibility in an area, but still the importance of that they have a picture of what that GM's work is and where the co-op's health and well-being is in that process. That's called the line of sight. So I'm going to stop sharing and say, so Siobhan, you were actually the first person who ever boiled down a training I was doing to, right, so checkbook equals reporting. I was like, what? Like, if they have any control, I've got a report in my hand, duh. And I was like, oh, and that was really, so I would like to ask you to, since you're so good at explaining this, to succinctly, can you just talk to people about what does that mean and how that played out for you guys? What reporting you got when you handed that checkbook?
Yeah, so this is where I get to talk about the dashboard, right? So so again, so I think this is where it's a little bit different for Rich. It sounds like Fredericksburg, they created the dashboard that they wanted Chris to use. We actually allowed Sam to create a dashboard to give to us. And then we got together and just as a board talked about what parts of it we liked, what parts of it we don't like. Is it telling us what we need to know? And then we were giving feedback to Sam. So I think at least in the very beginning, it did actually overwhelm a couple of the directors because there was a lot going on. And so one of the things that Sam did as a response to that was they changed it a little bit visually. They took a little bit out, but what they did with the stuff that they were taking out is they added it with a link as something you could click into, right? So we pared down what was on that first screen. That dashboard really is just the summary of everything. And then anybody who wants to click through, Sam is uploading those QuickBooks, because when you're in QuickBooks, you can print a balance sheet, you can print a profit and loss, you can do it for 30 days or 7 years. And so those were being uploaded and they were being linked to in the dashboard. So if any director wanted to click through and actually look at what was happening in greater detail, they could. And so again, there are several of us that do that, but it's because we have kind of a better financial literacy maybe. And then we have some directors that they don't. They look at the dashboard and they know that it's being supported by data and that there are a couple of us who are putting our eyes on that data. So does that help answer the question? JQ, you muted me.
Oh.
Instead of unmuting yourself. There you go.
Sorry. the cursor moved. Can you just take a moment and, I guess it seems self-evident, but I think your clarity on the transition of any power and responsibility over operations is partnered by reporting. Can you just speak to why that's so important?
Yeah, and it's everything that you just talked about. That's your window, right? If our GM is in charge of something, they need to be prepared to give us the information that we need in order to be the fiduciaries. And they need to give us the information that we need to conduct the oversight that is required. And it's really that simple. If you have the checkbook, we need a financial report every month.
Excellent. And Rich, I'd like to ask you, so you guys had the experience that, the GM was reporting, you created the dashboard, you were getting the reports, and, you'd created a line of sight, all's good. And then the need for the line of sight changed. Something kind of changed despite this really trusting relationship between board and GM. We have a reporting process, and then a monkey wrench came in. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So when we began our construction in 2020, it was during COVID, costs were substantially greater than we anticipated. And so our pro forma was built on certain cost estimates, our projections, and then the numbers came in significantly higher. So we needed to go back to the dashboard and revise the pro forma. We worked with NCGDC. Our general manager worked with NCGDC. And we did also, some of us on the board had direct conversations, and we looked at the line items and we figured out, where we needed to, where the numbers needed to move and what that did to the bottom line and also to the cash balances. The general manager also worked really hard to stay within those numbers and to, open the store with more cash than we were projecting in the revised, pro forma. So a little bit closer to the original rather than to the revised. We also worked really hard to build membership. During that time, we had a surge in membership. So when we launched our first owner loan campaign, we were right at 1,000 owners, and now we're at about 2,400. So that really helped our cash position. But I guess the bottom line is, we had to go back to the pro formas. We had to make changes. The pro formas had to go back to the board. We had conference calls or Zoom meetings with NCGDC, who were the outside, kind of financial experts working on the pro forma for us. And the board ultimately, approved changes, but that was kind of the process that, we ended up going through. It was not the fault of the general manager. It was a change in environment. And it was a change in the cost structure.
And I think an interesting point to how this went, though, is that, this GM is financially reporting. And so he could have figured out, oh, man, we're going to have cost overruns. And then his next response could have been, well, I'm just going to try and handle that on myself and do some rearranging and make things fit and not bring it up. He could have just, kept reporting, and eventually it would probably be self-evident in the reporting he was doing about the finances. But a lot of that money decisions you're making as a GM doesn't hit the P&L anytime soon or the balance sheet.
Sure.
It comes in later.
You back up a little bit. I mean, we're at the point of selecting a general contractor, and all the bids came in, much higher. None of the bids came in at the level that we had anticipated. And so those contracts would have had to been approved by the board. So our general manager was very transparent about all of it, but there was no way of hiding those costs from the board.
Because they'd created an additional line of sight, right? The board said, we have to approve the construction contracts.
Correct. I mean, we're talking about so much money involved, $1.4 million basically to build out the store in one contract. So, those kind of decisions, just a board would be not living up to its obligations if it was not involved in that approval process.
Absolutely. And it's just something I wanted to point out, because I think sometimes we have seen, it's rare, but we have seen GMs with just enough knowledge to be dangerous, and who have come in and been like, oh, well, that's operational. The GM decides this. And the board goes, oh, okay. And or they find ways to hide certain information in the reporting. So Fredericksburg developed another line of sight. They said, major contracts like that, we got to approve them. We're in the transition phase. You do not. And actually, I'll tell you, open co-ops that are building their second or third store, we're talking about spending $1.4 million. The board is involved in approval. But you need, a lot of startups might not know that. The other piece, though, that's hidden in here was that trust and relationship that both Siobhan and Rich talked about. They had reason to have confidence the GM would never hide this. We want to create as many lines of sight as possible in case, because people surprise us. I've seen it happen. Behavior we did not expect out of people we thought we trusted. But the second piece is the relationship and the trust building, and the certainty in that person is so key, both to give them the freedom to do what they need to do without, sucking all the oxygen out of the space they're trying to work in, but also because in the end, a good GM could hide something from most boards, at least for a period of time. So I just wanted to reflect that it was both that they created multiple lines of sight, and that they had also really put in the energy to build a really trusting relationship with their GM. And to know that they could trust that person. Anything else on this checkbook equals reporting piece either of you wanted a moment to say? Okay. Well, then we'll move on to the last major point we really wanted to make, and then we'll open for questions. A great one from Dana, so I'm gonna get through this one pretty quick. And other questions, if you guys are starting to have them, throw them in the chat. The budget / pro forma. Now, in most food clubs, you'll hear people talk about the budget at this piece. You'll hear some of us using the word pro forma, because for startup food co-ops, that pro forma often becomes the annual budget because it's so detailed and it's in there until a little further down the road. No matter which one it is, the budget or pro forma, the master financial plan for the period of time is usually, we say that's a joint leadership team document. The GM formulates it, gets feedback from the board, integrates that feedback. It is the GM's document. They have to work off of it. They build it with their team, ideally. But the board must approve it as the major financial responsible party, ultimately, for the co-op. So it's your joint document, but but the board ultimately has, it also has approval. I'm going to turn to Siobhan to talk about why ultimately can the GM not make changes to the pro forma without discussing it with the board? Why does the board have control of this when the budget's so operational?
Yeah, and it's again because that becomes the document that you're holding your GM accountable to, right? So I guess, you know, there are lots of different ways to think about success, right? But one of them, you bet your bippy, is financial success. And we have member loans. We're going to have a bank loan, right? And all of these loans were made looking at this certain set of assumptions that's in the pro forma, assumptions about how much cash you'll have, you know, when do you have, you know, positive EBITDA, when do you have ultimate profitability? And so you need to know how the store is performing against those benchmarks. And if there's a change, then that is a place where the board needs to be involved, right? Because the board has made a decision, has made a determination that this project is financially feasible. And that is a decision that we communicated to all of our owners. And we did it when we asked them for money, right? We asked our owners to loan us money because we were saying we had a high degree of confidence that this thing was going to be financially feasible. And so you know, if there are going to be differences between projected and actual, it's so important for the board to know that.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to ask Rich, kind of, I know you guys went through this. There were pro forma changes that need to be approved. I know actually Siobhan did as well. But you know, what kind of things qualify to come back to the board? If I decide that, you know, I'm your GM and, you know, we need to spend $50,000 we weren't expecting to spend on consulting, does that come to the board? You know, how did you and the GM kind of navigate what has to come back to the board as a change rather than just maybe a blip of a budget variance?
Sure. First of all, let me say how much I agree with what Siobhan said about the role of the board and how well she put it. I don't think I could add anything to that. Secondly, so, you know, in the first year of operation, our co-op, probably most startup co-ops, we just use the pro forma as the budget for the first year. So the board, we spent a lot of time on the pro forma. We wrestled it to the ground. We came up with the first year, you know, kind of income statement and balance sheet. And so the income statement essentially is the budget for the year. Now, the general manager reports to us, you know, on a monthly basis. He prepares a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet, and we get the comparison against the pro forma. And so, you know, he's being judged on how he's meeting, you know, the big numbers, which basically would be, you know, revenues. Are revenues coming out where they need to be? Is EBITDA coming out where it needs to be? Is the bottom line coming out where it needs to be? We also judge him based upon our other metrics, like what percent of what we sell is local. What are we doing from a community perspective in terms of SNAP sales? We want to have those at least at a certain level. So the board is looking at the big numbers. We have enough confidence in our general manager that if something, you know, really crazy is happening, he's going to come to us and say, we have this huge expense. Let's say something goes wrong with something and we have a huge expense. He's going to come back to us and we're going to talk about it. That hasn't happened. We hired a general manager who's excellent on, you know, cost control. And so, which I strongly recommend, because as a board, it's very operational and it's very difficult as a board to drill down into, you know, do you have too many people in the deli section? Do you have too much of this or too little of that? I don't know if I've answered the question, but I guess I would just say the board is really looking at the big picture, at the big metrics. When you get in the minutia between, one cost item is a little higher and others a little lower, don't lose any brain cells over it. Focus on the big picture, on the viability of the co-op, on whether you're meeting the goals that you set out when you started the co-op.
Wow, both of you, so well said. Thank you. I want to make sure we get to at least one or two questions here that have come through. So I'm going to jump to those, but feel free to add anything else you were like wanting to say that I cut you off. Dana asked from Chicago Market, were financial reports like a treasurer's report prepared by the treasurer being shared with the board previous to the GM's financial reporting? And if so, how was it different? Either of you want to take that?
Yeah, I can jump in. So, to begin with, the answer is yes. Every month, the treasurer shared financial reports. He shared income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement. So we got that every month. Now, our treasurer is a very financially astute individual. Having said that, our startup was not into spending a lot of money. We did everything ourselves. When we hired a general manager, he began to bring in, outside experts, retail financial services, and we're using a CPA firm and all that kind of stuff. So the level of professionalism in our monthly financials is definitely higher now than it was when we were a startup, but the need for it is much more now. But having said all that, we're seeing the same reports we were seeing when we were going through our 5.5 years, a startup. So that helps the board also. And the board has also gotten financial training throughout the years. So I would say also maybe a little different than Siobhan's co-op. The dashboard that we have is really helpful to a lot of the board members because probably some of our board members really probably wouldn't be too comfortable going through the income statement and balance sheet and really seeing what's going on. And the dashboard really accomplishes that. So as a board member, I think it's really important that all board members understand the financials of the co-op, not just a few experts. And so a dashboard really helps. You can really make the dashboard focus on what is it that every board member should know. And then I love what Siobhan said about you can click and drill down and get more detail. That's terrific. We don't have that click function, but we have we have all the detail in other formats. And some of us, go through all the details.
Yeah, it's funny. It sounds like you and I kind of ended up in the same place, even though we started from different directions. Like you started with your dashboard and Sam started with their dashboard, but for us, that dashboard really is a high level summary now.
Right.
So it is the goal is to make it completely accessible to every director, regardless of how much they do or are not comfortable with financial statements.
Perfect.
I think it's absolutely perfect from both of you. That's wonderful. And I love what Rich is pointing to, which is something really subtle I want to point out, which is everyone on the board should have financial literacy about the dashboard. The financial numbers on the dashboard are the ones the board needs to understand the overall financial health of the co-op. Some folks on the board need to know how to drill down behind the dashboard and make sure the supporting numbers are there, but the whole board doesn't need that. So what I often hear is, oh, I'm not the financial person. Oh, financial, Rich is talking something really important here. Everyone needs financial education on the board, but it only has to be to the dashboard level. We will not drown those of you who are terrified of math and everything that goes behind the dashboard. And I think, Siobhan, that to some extent is what some of your board experienced, right? It was almost like, at first, Sam's reporting is awesome, but it was almost like a deluge of numbers. Can you talk about getting to that comfort where the board had the right line of sight to be able to answer the financial questions?
Yeah. So Sam was providing a lot of information to us, which is great because that's a much better problem to have than if you have a GM that's not giving you enough information or not giving you the information that you need, right? Both things are really important. So we were getting a lot of detailed information about what exactly was being spent and against which category was it being spent against, and where were we at, not only for the year to date and the month, but where were we at for the year to date and the month in each of those categories in the chart of accounts. And some of my directors, it was a little overwhelming. And so, so what we did was, because Sam's really good in Excel, luckily, what they did was they collapsed a lot of the details down. And so now you have this picture that, again, it's high level overview, and you can expand any section that you want. And you can see, anybody who wants to can kind of get in and see what's going on.
Excellent. It's just another illustration that sometimes this is something we see, that the GM in good faith offers as much information as they can. That's not actually necessarily a line of sight for you as a board. You guys have to come to an agreement about what the board needs to know and how the GM can arrange it so you can see it.
Right. Because if you're not able to discern the information that you need, then it's not helpful reporting. It's just gobbledygook. If any one person isn't able to kind of zero in and say, okay, what I need to know is, are we on budget, over budget, or under budget? Like, if that's the question that you're asking, everybody needs to be able to get the answer to that question and not have it get lost in all of the categories, basically.
And Dana mentioned something here, and we're gonna handle this one last, and then we're gonna go into some wrap up, because I'm really strict about stopping on time, as y'all know, and respecting your time. But Dana brings up, like, well, how would we know what is the stuff we need to see? Not again, if we don't have the financial expertise, which is a very smart question, is a question that I know both these startups had to wander through the darkness themselves and decide. So someone did mention, can we get at least like a screenshot of what their dashboards look like? And I will talk to both co-ops and see if there's a way to do that protects their information. So you can see, I think the goal is not necessarily to have a copy of it, but to see what's on a dashboard. I'll see if we can make that happen. But any comments, thoughts, Rich, on how to decide what you need on the dashboard?
Sure. Well, let me go back and kind of try to address the question. So I think we step back and we say, okay, from a common sense perspective, what does the board really, need to know? And I would go back to one of Saban's points, that the board represented to the membership that this co-op was financially viable. The board did that by studying and understanding the pro forma. So the board needs to satisfy itself that the projections in the pro forma are holding up during the construction period, that we're not overspending, and then also during operations, that the revenues and the expenses are holding up to what was in the pro forma. So not that all of that is in our control. Like, our co-ops are, we couldn't hit the numbers in the pro forma from a construction perspective. Okay, that's fine. You back up and you say, okay, the pro forma said we're going to be spending, $1.5 million. We're going to be spending, let's say 800,000 on construction. Well, darn, the cheapest contract we have is 1.4 million. What does that do to our numbers? What do we need to cut? So the board needs to look at those numbers that allow it to measure against the pro forma, and just see, are you hitting those numbers? Are you not hitting them? I think at a high level, that's really what you need to know. Like, what did you as a board member promise the membership? And are you living up to that promise?
Excellent. I'm going to leave it there because we are so tight on time. I want to take the moment, and if they have a minute to stay after, I'll let them stay. You can ask me more questions, but I just want to take a minute to thank Siobhan Mitchell and Richard LaRochelle, just for sharing their time and their expertise with us once again with the peer community. Really, really appreciate them. So I just want to give them that hand. And I did want to real quick let you guys know what's coming up in the series. So you will get an email after this one that will have the slides for this, and if they're able to share screenshots, I will send those. So you'll get those if you registered for this event. Coming up tomorrow is North Flint, a GM perspective. This is the North Flint grocery co-op. Arlene Wilborn, who's on this call, is their general manager and is going to be presenting to us very much about the GM perspective on getting hired and in that transition and what's going on in Flint. I think it's going to be phenomenal. I hope you guys join us. And then Thursday, we have the wrong thing in here. Never mind. Ignore the middle one. Actually, oh my goodness, accepting online payments is this Thursday at 12 Central. And this was something you guys requested that we had to put together last minute. I know Katie Condrit's on the call, who is one of the people one of your peers who's going to be presenting with me, talking about all the complexities of accepting payments online, the technology behind it, how to do it, because so much of our presence, especially now, is online as a startup food co-op. So that stuff is coming up. I want to thank our sponsors and just take a moment who make this possible: the National Cooperative Grocers, the National Cooperative Bank, and the Blooming Prairie Foundation. With that, am going to stop recording. And if anyone wants to stay and ask a few more questions, if any of our speakers are able, we will